Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We're here to explore how you can empower students with Aquifer's formative assessment. My name is Megan Hotelling, and I'm Aquifer's Educator Engagement and Events Manager. Aquifer, a nonprofit founded in 2000 by health professions educators, provides students with access to virtual patient cases and a comprehensive learning system created by an educators consortium. The system covers core rotations and clinical excellence topics while incorporating assessment and content. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, Kim Tartaglia and Cindy Lord. Dr. Kim Tartaglia is a professor of medicine at The Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center, where she serves as academic program director for the Med 3-year program, director of the I'm Well program for internal medicine residents, and director of faculty mentorship. Her expertise includes undergraduate medical education, performance coaching and mentorship, physician well-being, and lifestyle medicine. Dr. Tartaglia is also a founding member of Aquifer's peer trainers and the current editor-in-chief. The peer trainers are a special board within the Aquifer Consortium designed to support programs with tools and professional development to improve the adoption and use of Aquifer's content, assessments, services, and resources. Cindy is a seasoned health professions educator and dedicated Aquifer volunteer. She has served as an associate professor at Case Western and founding director of their PA program. Cindy spearheaded key initiatives at Aquifer, including the PA Task Force and Peer Trainer Board. She is an active peer trainer with expertise in integrating Aquifer into your curriculum, strategies for active learning, and coaching learners. We would love for you to engage with us a little bit today by utilizing the chat. So if you'd like to share where you're logging in from, that would be awesome. And we would also like to know what your experience is with formative assessment so far. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Cindy Lord.
Well, thanks, Megan, and welcome to everyone. So today's webinar will be broken down into 3 parts. We're going to start by making the case for formative assessment. Formative assessment is a necessary component to catalyzing self-directed learning. Next, we'll introduce you to Calibrate, Aquifer's formative assessment aligned with their clinical cases and designed for actionable feedback. This is an easy-to-use tool you can deploy within your program. Finally, we'll introduce you to our newest assessment tool from Aquifer called Practice Smart. Released at the end of July, Practice Smart is a student-controlled question bank with nearly 1,000 clinically relevant items aligned with Aquifer cases. Before we dig in, though, let's do a quick poll. And our question for the poll is, what is your biggest barrier to using formative assessment tools effectively? And if you just want to click on, which one you choose, is it a lack of time to implement or limited understanding or training in tools, difficulty integrating the tools, or insufficient institutional support? Okay, so I don't know if everyone can see it.
Cindy, do you see it on your screen? I went ahead and shared
the results. But I don't see the results say 0. So I don't know.
Vote?
Did I vote?
Yeah. Did you choose one? Oh, there you go. Did that work?
No.
Okay. Do you want me to read them out loud quickly?
Yes.
Okay. So 30% said lack of time to implement or analyze results. 30% said limited understanding or training in the tools. And 18% said difficulty integrating tools into the existing curriculum. And 18% insufficient institutional support or resources. So you're pretty
so we got
even across the board.
Even across the board. All right, so we're going to move on and to the next slide. Great. So one of the things that's important to understand about Aquifer is that it's more than just clinical cases. Most of us know Aquifer as the curriculum resource we use to enhance or fill gaps in students' clinical experiences. Aquifer aims to build a holistic system, which means also having an assessment that supports insight and generates valuable feedback to deepen the clinical competence by completing Aquifer cases, or whether they have secured some clinical competence and should focus their energy on more meaningful clinical experiences. This webinar will discuss Aquifer's assessments for learning. But before we get into the tools themselves, let's just take a quick minute to talk about formative assessment. Next slide. So let's start by asking the question, what is formative assessment and why does it matter? So I'm going to just kind of stop for a second and just kind of share a quick story, which I'm sure many of you will resonate with you because you probably have been down the same path. Is that, I had a student who was using one of the many test banks that we had, and they were a good student in their preclinical year. I had a couple little bumps, but they weren't on the high risk list. And they got to clinicals and they really were struggling. And they were just doing test questions, these test banks, they were doing hundreds of questions. And they weren't scoring very well. And I looked at that dashboard one day and I talked to them and I said, hey, have you looked at the dashboard to see how you're doing? And they said, oh, yes. But when I read the answers and the explanation to the questions, I feel good about it. So I said, well, what is your plan? What learning plan do you devise after that? And they said, well, I read the response and I understand it. And then I do more test questions and I go back and I read on the topic. So if it was a cardiology question, they go and they think they're going to read all of cardiology, which never happens. So they were struggling a bit with their shelf and their end of rotation exams. And so I implemented formative assessment. And from that, they became actively engaged. They gained confidence because they were getting frustrated that they were getting all these things what they thought wrong. So instead of looking at the question on cardiomyopathy and realizing, oh, it was really the signs and symptoms and how that associates with the physical findings that I'll see, they thought they didn't know anything about cardiomyopathy. So formative assessment gave them this safe space that allowed them to regain their confidence, and they actually were able to develop more targeted learning plans than I'm going to study all of cardiology, which again isn't very realistic when you've already been through your preclinical year. All right, next slide. So, one context in which we discuss the importance of formative assessment, of course, is accreditation. It's essential to demonstrate that formative assessment is being used in most accreditation systems. And because of its association with accreditation, formative assessment is often linked to mid-clerkship or mid-rotation feedback, or as a method of identifying students needing remediation. However, the most effective use of formative assessment is to promote self-directed learning and to catalyze student growth. Next slide. So as you know, formative assessment has been shown to impact learning significantly. When done thoughtfully, formative assessment can catalyze growth and development, reduce uncertainty, and enable focused, efficient gain in skills and knowledge and mastery. So, here, just if I can highlight for a minute, the benefit a student had from formative assessment. A student I had, they participated in the Calibrate beta testing, and they were like, okay, yeah, this is okay. And they were like, but it's not like the test bank questions. And I said, well, just keep doing them. And what they figured out along the way is that they did do Aquifer cases. They connected them, when they had a question that they didn't get right, they went to the case. And what they told me is that they didn't realize, but what it did is it really deepened their learning experience on clinicals. And this individual said to me, I was able to think better and think through patient cases better because of what I learned. Not that the case was the same, but there were relationships and they had that critical thinking skill on them. They also shared something that I thought was quite interesting, was that they felt that they had richer, more meaningful discussions with their preceptor than they had before, and other students didn't have at the same rotation. So sometimes it's those subtle connections and things that happen. Okay, next slide. So for formative assessment to have impact, it generally needs to possess the following characteristics. It needs to be low stakes, and it needs to avoid to be used for judgment. It focuses on feedback to improve mastery, skills, and attitudes, and it empowers self-regulation and reflection. In short, formative assessment isn't about judging or grading students. High quality, we have enough summative assessment to do that, and we do it frequently. But high quality formative assessment provides information, instills values, and inspires lifelong learning. When assessment is designed to empower students rather than to evaluate them, it creates an environment where students feel comfortable acknowledging their gaps and working to close those gaps and chart their progress. In this sense, describing an assessment as formative is about how it's used, not the type or the level of questions or the level of test acuity or when it's deployed in the learning cycle. Unfortunately, what we call formative assessment is often misused to evaluate or to filter students, which can undermine their learning benefits. Summative assessments have their place, but conflating summative and formative assessments diminishes the significant value of low-stakes formative assessments. All right, next slide. Well, we're going to do another poll. Megan, you may have to do it because mine says it's in test. Oh, I can vote now. All right, well, we're going to do another poll. Which do you find most challenging to implement in formative assessments? And your choice is, of course, low stakes, feedback focused, or empowers self-regulation and reflection. All right, so Megan, you will have to do it again because I am in what it calls draft mode. Doesn't let me vote.
I can do that.
So if you want to share that.
I'll just give people another moment. We've only got a couple votes. So you should see a link on the right-hand side of your screen that says polls. Might be able to find it there. Oh yeah, they're coming in. All right, so overwhelmingly, empowers self-regulation and reflection, 90% response.
Yeah.
And feedback focused was another.
Yeah. And that self-regulation and reflection, it's hard for us to teach, right? Students want it, but they don't want it, right? They want that ability, but then they're nervous. So let's talk a little bit now about Calibrate. So Calibrate was intentionally designed to be a formative assessment that educators deploy, but students use to direct their own learning. Calibrate is intended as an assessment for learning, not of learning. And I think that's a really important distinction. So going back to the student I told you about who was doing all those test questions, test banks are assessments of learning, right? So do you know the answer to this question? And before you can get there, you have to walk before you can run. Before you can get there, you need to know how to learn. And so assessments for learning, where students can, again, calibrate and readjust and assess their own learning, is really what we're trying to do here. So Calibrate works with the Aquifer cases, which is even better. So they're not just left with like a test bank. You have a question and you just have to figure out where you're going to get information. Here, they're directed back to a specific case and to specific areas in the case where they can strengthen and, reassess themselves. So the cases are designed to support their journey, not to rank or grade them. Okay, next slide. So the assessment itself is called Calibrate for a reason, because it helps students calibrate their competence. We want that gap, as you can see, actual and perceived. We want that gap between perceived and actual cognitive competence to be narrow. Now, as you all know, right, in your strong learners, and your strong learners probably have the least amount of gap. It's your struggling learners who oftentimes perceive they know something when in actuality they don't, and it doesn't show up until they take a test. So here the goal is that they can find those gaps well before they're taking those more high stakes summative evaluations, and they can recalibrate themselves. So Calibrate supports metacognition. Do you know what you think you know? And are you aware of the things that you don't know? Do you know what you don't know? We know that when clinicians think that they're more prepared for clinical care than they are, it puts patients in danger. So we can help our learners identify and close these gaps with thoughtful use of Calibrate. Okay, next slide. So Calibrate's designed to be used twice during a clinical rotation or clerkship, once early and once late. So the early learning supports in-rotation learning. You take it early, you find your gaps, and then you can address those gaps during your rotation so that when you take the late exam, that helps to prepare them for the shelf exam. And more importantly, because it's always about the test, but really when you all said you want them to be, kind of self-driven, directed learners, it needs to inform future learning. And that's really the big goal. So Calibrate is aligned with Aquifer course cases and case content, which also mean it's aligned with the national curriculum for each clinical focus. So each question, next slide, each question is associated with a specific case in Aquifer. So what type of Calibrate assessments are available today? Well, we currently have 5 different assessments. We have internal medicine. There's 41 total questions, which 36 are scored. Family Med has 45 questions with 40 being scored. Peds has 37 with 32 being scored. Radiology has 24 questions with 19 being scored. And neurology has 20 total questions and 13 are scored. So the Calibrate assessment questions are written by clinicians, validated, and they follow a standard board type approach. So there's a short vignette followed by a single best answer multiple choice question, but it does have the additional requirement that learners identify their level of certainty in each answer. And that's what the real beauty of this is. The certainty rating adds a new dimension to assessment results, taking feedback beyond right or wrong answers and provides a more detailed metacognitive analysis of a student's applied knowledge base and understanding. Calibrate assessments are easy to administer and they don't need to be proctored, which is nice, and it certainly eases the burden on the program. IM and FM are the longest. They take just under an hour on average to complete. Peds takes about 45 minutes, and radiology and neuro each take about 20 minutes to complete. So again, not real taxing like a shelf exam. Next slide. So each item is scored and is given at what's called a clinical learning calibration category. The clinical learning calibration combines accuracy, right or wrong, certainty, I think I know it. I definitely know it. I don't. I'm not sure. I don't know it. And then efficiency. How quickly did they answer the question? And it combines them into a single measure with 5 levels from warning to excel. The calibration levels are designed to shine a light on both the areas of relative strength, which are things like excel and competent, as well as known areas of limited knowledge. And these are words like unsure and novice levels. And Aquifer has been really, really deliberate and careful with those words like, you really don't know this, wrong, red. We kind of started with that good old red, yellow, green, and red was very bothersome to students. So now we use terms that are a little more, again, friendly and more suitable for formative assessment. Like you don't want to scare a student with what they didn't know, right? We want that to enhance like, oh, I have a gap here. I want to fix that. So uncertain and novice, again, where students are uncertain of their knowledge. Importantly, areas of miscalibration are called warning, where the students certainly know something, but their knowledge is actually limited and they don't. So targeting feedback beyond the right and wrong answers gives learners the tools to transform that feedback into targeted goals for clinical practice by completing the relevant Aquifer cases. I know what you're thinking before I assign this to my students. Can I try it out, right? We all want to look at it. And the answer is yes, you can. So in the chat, we will put a link. If it's not there, there's going to be a link for you where you can sign up to have a really nice demo set up. You'll have access to, it's an 8-question assessment. And you'll get the student experience, including taking the assessment and analyzing the results. And again, you see, there it is. Joe put that up for you if you're interested. There it is. Students receive a very detailed report. It's got 5 different tabs, and it really goes into a lot of detail. Overall, it gives them, that's their first page, and then it gets into the specifics with them of each question and where in the question. So it doesn't give them the answer. That's not what we're looking for, but what it gives them is the learning objective. So this question was focused on developing a differential, and then it points them to the aquifer case where they can find that information and re-look at that or restudy it and go through that case again if that's an area where they struggled. Remember, and the faculty, you get a report. It's a little more general because, again, we're not judging and we're not grading here. So you'll get overall report. And then what you do get is a nice cohort report. And I really like that because you could look and say from cohort to cohort, wow, they're all struggling with this. There's a question, it seems something on cardiomyopathy and physical findings. It seems everyone's struggling. Gee, maybe we want to look at that and address that, look at where we're teaching that in the curriculum. Do we want to beef that up a little bit? If you're a PA program here, I will tell you that this is a great way to try another piece of data point that you can triangulate with your data when you're looking at assessment and how you're assessing students. Again, med school, NP schools, the same thing. It's a nice data point for triangulating your data for accreditation. And so just remember that true formative assessment is low stakes. It focuses on feedback to the student and empowers them to self-regulate and reflect so that they can improve their mastery, their skills, and their attitudes. Okay, so moving on, let's just take a minute to break down some of the benefits of Calibrate. First, it gives students a detailed map of their strengths and weaknesses. It isn't about pointing out their flaws, it's about illuminating paths for growth. Students do get immediate access to their overall results, which is nice. And you can see on the screen here, you can see how they have 4 tabs, sorry. So they get their overall results, then they get their calibration, knowledge, certainty, and then their final tab is that nice learning plan. So they can take what they're learning and calibrate it and make a plan right away. Instead of it being disjointed and having to figure out, I better write down a learning plan, they can make that learning plan right there. They can create that. They can put things on their to-do list in Calibrate, in Aquifer. So it's really nice. Okay, next slide. And they also get, this is that detailed level. So they get that detailed item level information they can analyze for accuracy and certainty. So again, you can see where they've got the learning calibration. That first one says warning, and then the question content versus let me just know the question and the answer. And then there's a teaching point. You click right into it, and then it gives them their clinical focus. And then they ultimately have the option to put something on their to-do list. So on the screen, the student view shows you how the students can see how they performed by item, the answer explanation, decision category, and the case, as I said. So this brings me to the second benefit of Calibrate, and that is that it promotes metacognition and goal setting. And again, when you look at your standards and your accreditation standards, all of us have that little standard in there about teaching critical thinking, clinical reasoning skills. And so again, this will help with that. Students have access to the results, which means they can determine what they need and set goals with this data. The ability to accurately assess oneself and set meaningful goals is imperative. Next slide. But why is all of this so important? Well, as we know, medical knowledge is expanding at an unprecedented rate, and clinicians can't know everything. Because the clinical learning environment is inherently challenging, we need to give students access to information that empowers them to develop without the constant support of educators. And you all kind of said that in that first poll. When provided with information that encourages self-regulated learning, students must self-assess, direct new learning, and evaluate progress. To be prepared for this reality, students need to develop adaptive expertise. That is, the ability to efficiently apply their foundational knowledge to everyday problems while innovating solutions for novel situations. And that's the story I shared about the student who felt they did better on clinical because they were applying that basic knowledge they gained and garnered from the Aquifer cases and Calibrate. They did that application of that thought process in their clinicals, and they felt that difference. So by providing insight without judgment, Calibrate supports students in identifying areas for improvement, developing those all-important metacognitive skills and building the adaptive clinical expertise they'll need. The goal of Calibrate is not just preparing students for exams. It's intended to support the development of skills and attitudes that support lifelong learning. When assessment is low stakes, generates feedback, and empowers self-regulation, it is formative and has potential for impact. One of the features that makes Calibrate especially useful is that students have options for what to do next when they analyze their data. Again, I'll just share, a story about a student who realized the importance of adaptive expertise. And that's that same student where they did these cases and then they felt like their clinical rotation went better because they were thinking better. And again, that hidden curriculum where they developed deeper, richer relationships with their preceptors. And they said they just learned so much more from them than, okay, go see this patient. Oh, did you write this note? They actually had conversation about treatment plans, about pathophysiology, and the student felt very comfortable, and the preceptor felt the same. Next slide. So when a student is analyzing their data, they can immediately add the relevant case to their to-do list, as I explained, and you'll see that red arrow there. Just click and add to their to-do list, which they can also prioritize. When they get to their to-do list, they can move things up and down. So in the case on the screen, the item was rated novice, meaning that the student was incorrect and uncertain. So this might be an example where the student would want to complete the associated case to learn the concept in a clinical context versus something where they showed competence or they excelled. Don't need to do that. So for that first student story I told you about, that student was trying to study all of cardiology every time they got some cardiology questions wrong, instead of really being specific and focusing and saying, oh, this is what I need to look at. So it really does. And then they gain confidence because your struggling learners, as you know, not only they think they know what they know until they take a test, and then they realize, and then they just lose all confidence. And it's so hard to get them back on board when they've lost their confidence. So this helps build their confidence as well. Okay, next slide. So when the student clicks on the add button, they can quickly add the case with a due date. It puts some onus on them to actually do it. So this puts the case on the student's to-do list, and it's a seamless way to ensure that while they're analyzing their results, they can select a high-quality learning resource and set a time-bound goal, which is very important, not mañana. I'll do everything tomorrow. This gives them a due date. I also want to point out that the students do have an option to add quiz questions to their to-do list. And this is what we're going to talk about next. But before I turn it over to Kim, I want to introduce Practice Smart to you. Let me just quickly recap those key characteristics of Calibrate. So remember, Calibrate is a formative assessment tool designed to support learning by helping students calibrate their perceived and actual competence. It promotes metacognition through early and late assessments during the clerkship and clinical rotations, providing nuanced feedback with certainty ratings, and it is aligned to the Aquifer cases and to the national curriculum to ensure relevant, high-quality content. Kim, take it away.
Thanks, Cindy. I'm excited to talk to you about Practice Smart because I think it is the perfect complement to Calibrate. But before I do that, let's launch one more poll. This one is, what is your biggest challenge in encouraging self-directed learning amongst your students? I'll wait for a couple more votes. So it seems like the winners are uncertainty about the effectiveness of self-directed learning tools, as well as limited time to really guide students to use these tools effectively. And so I hope you'll see that Practice Smart is really designed to help tackle all of these issues. What I'm hearing from my clinical students at OSU is that they feel compelled to use these question banks that, think they're going to help do well on end of clerkship exams, but they're doing it at the expense of preparing for their patient encounters. And they acknowledge they're not an active learner in any of this process. And so I see that disconnect with the self-directed learning that Cindy was referring to. Here's a basic description of Practice Smart. It's a set of assessment questions designed to support and encourage self-directed learning for your students. offering nearly 1,000 items based on the content of Aquifer's clinical cases, which you know are based on national standards for our various courses and clerkships. The questions are crafted by those same expert educators who are responsible for Aquifer's cases, and so you know that there's high quality content across the board. Importantly, since each item in Practice Smart Bank is related to an Aquifer case, students have vetted content to really reinforce their learning and go back to. And it's designed to be a private space. So this is for students only to assess their knowledge with features like customizable quizzes and filters for targeted learning. We'll go into all of those details. And so why are we talking about this if it's not a tool for you as an educator, but solely for the students? Well, one, many educators tell me that they don't know what resources their students are using. And when they ask those questions, they're really disappointed in the quality of the resources, whether it be certain flashcards or question banks that are really popular. Two, Practice Smart is already available to your students, and we know that they're using it. So over 3,000 questions being answered a day since it was launched in early August. And we want you to be aware of what they're doing and the quality of that resource so that you can feel comfortable recommending it. And finally, as Cindy alluded to, this is another tool to promote self-directed learning. So again, while Practice Smart alone may not be sufficient to meet the standard for the full accrediting body's self-directed learning standard, it's just one way you can show students how your students are identifying their learning needs and trying to find resources to meet their needs. So let's dive into Practice Smart and what makes them so unique and valuable for clinical education. At their core, Practice Smart questions are designed to mirror the complexities of real-world clinical practice. And so you can see that these questions present clinically focused scenarios. We're not just asking isolated recall facts or textbook definitions. Instead, each question places the student in a realistic clinical situation, much like the ones they'll encounter on their rotations or in practice. So take this question on the screen. This question is based on what a student would have learned by completing PEDS Case 18, a 6-week-old boy who has poor feeding. You'll see that while the case concerns a 6-week-old, this question concerns a 5-year-old. And you'll know probably if you've done that case case dives into heart murmurs and cardiac congenital heart defects and the decision making that goes along with an associated history and physical exam findings. And so this is an example of students not just rote memorizing, that case and taking a question on it that's very similar, but really learning to apply knowledge in certain scenarios. Second, the students are, as you can see, are capturing their level of certainty here. So similar to Calibrate, they capture their level of certainty. And so when they find out for these Practice Smart questions, they'll find out whether or not they were right or wrong and what their certainty level was. And that both pieces of information could be used to help them decide what to do next. So next slide. Unlike Calibrate, which must be assigned by the program and has a time limit, Practice Smart really items are selected by the student and they can linger as long as they want on them. They can also have several options for what to do when completing the item. So let me explain. Here again is that same item from the previous slide. If the student is working in study mode, then they receive the answer question, the correct answer and the answer explanation as soon as they submit the question. You'll see it down there below. In this case, the student correctly identified sort of the physical exam findings and history to be associated with an atrial septal defect and what to do about it. At the bottom of that, though, if they were wrong or if they were unsure, they can go directly to the case. They can add the case to their to-do list if they think they need more time to review. And of course, if the student was certain and right, as in this situation, they may not, on this alone, add something to their to-do list. Next slide. But let's say a student does all the questions associated with the case. And in this example, they answered only one of the 4 of them correctly. The others they were wrong and uncertain on. Hopefully this student would notice that they really can't apply the content covered in the case, whether they've done it before or they are, have done this as almost a pre-test. And so probably should add it to their to-do list. Again, maybe focusing on the areas that are more problematic for them. And this just highlights kind of how we're trying to empower the student to self-assess and make decisions about what to study next. Next slide. One of the features of Practice Smart is that students are exposed to questions in many different ways. So students can engage with the questions within the cases that you see in box 1. Students work through the case and they can immediately test their understanding. And that's what Aquifer had offered sort of prior to the launch of Practice Smart. You can also do it from case lists, so where students can access questions sets associated with specific cases or topics that they've studied, as you see in item 2. Or they can use the quiz generator. And this powerful tool allows students to create custom quizzes tailored to their needs. And I think students really like this feature. In doing so, Practice Smart is empowering the students to focus on their areas of weakness or interest. And this flexibility means students can seamlessly integrate Practice Smart into their preferred study methods, whether, again, reviewing the specific case or preparing for an exam. So in this slide, I want to dive into the quiz generator and how it allows students to filter questions by topic, body system, or even their past performance. For instance, a student who realizes they're struggling in cardiology can create a quiz to reinforce those concepts. Perhaps they've noticed that from their Calibrate early assessment, and now they're like, I'm going to create a quiz, to really focus on those skills right now and do those associated cases. Or a student interested in pediatrics can dive deep into that area. Students can identify their knowledge gaps, create focused study sessions, and really track their progress. So this isn't about just answering questions. It's about engaging them in a comprehensive system that develops both clinical reasoning and those metacognitive skills. So in essence, Practice Smart is really one tool to turn every student into the driver of their own learning, fostering that kind of self-directed study skills to support lifelong learning. Now go to the next slide. You'll see a student dashboard. Actually, sorry, one back.
I got a little too excited. Sorry, Kim.
That's it.
Let's see here. This one.
Okay.
And sorry, which slide are we on? 25.
26.
Okay. There we go.
Okay, thank you. Here's a student dashboard. And so where at a glance, you can see the work that a student's completed in Aquifer. And you can also see down below the number of Practice Smart questions with both accuracy and certainty ratings. As mentioned before, without much promotion, students have found these questions and are doing them to the tune of 3,000 questions per day. And when we survey students, or when Aquifer surveyed students, 7 out of 10 of them rated their experience with Practice Smart as either a 4 or a 5. Next slide. And so here you can see a deeper dive that a student would view to see how they're doing on certain questions associated with individual cases. So you'll notice they've completed a number of quizzes related to radiology cases and have done well on a number of them. Next slide. And so under the system breakdown, this student might see that though their cardiovascular disease knowledge appears to be an area of opportunity. So that might prompt them to, do the relevant cases or set up a quiz just based on those cardiovascular disease questions. And so you can see all throughout a student's coursework, early Calibrate, doing Practice Smart questions, and then late Calibrate, they're getting information. How am I doing? Where is my areas of focus should be? And that's, again, I think, how we hope that students will use this. Next slide. So unlike Calibrate, you can't directly assign Practice Smart questions to your students. However, you can influence their use through case assignments. Here's how. Assign cases that, this example is really where students could create a quiz on the cardiovascular system from across the curriculum. They could have up to 109 items on that quiz, and they could do it that way. Again, deciding how many questions they want on their quiz, or they could go to the patient library and find cases in family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, or whatever areas had cardiovascular content that they were interested in. Next slide. So unlike Calibrate, you can't assign questions directly. And for Practice Smart, students just have access to them. It's part of the subscription and it's part of their access. However, you can influence their use through your case assignments. Here are some ways to do that. 1, assign cases that align with your current curriculum focus. When students complete the cases, they will naturally more likely engage with the Practice Smart items. 2, you can highlight the connection between the assigned cases and Practice Smart. Maybe they haven't noticed or haven't found it yet. And so remind students that each case has related questions that they can use to reinforce their learning. And 3, encourage students to use Practice Smart as a follow-up to case completion. It helps assess their understanding in the moment and identify areas of further study. And so by assigning relevant cases, you're indirectly guiding students towards valuable practice smart content, increasing the likelihood of both engagement and completion of their casework. And of course, the use of Calibrate as bookends early and late in your course is just another useful formative assessment for students to focus their learning towards more cases, targeting towards patient encounters that they can use to enhance their learning, as well as doing practice smart questions. All right. So with that, I am happy to open it up for any questions.
Okay. Thank you both so much. That was a really great overview of Practice Smart. I'm very excited about that tool.
It is a fun tool that requires no work for you as an educator. So I think that's, one of the beauties of it.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like Joe shared a flyer about Practice Smart as well in the chat that you can share with faculty or staff. So be sure to check out that link, and we'll make sure that we send it as well with the follow-up on the recording, so you can share any of that information with your colleagues. Let's see what else. Joe also mentioned that if you are interested in meeting with a member of the adoption and use team, you can use the link that he's provided to select a time. People like Kim and Cindy are more than happy to go through and chat with you about the best ways to use your Aquifer subscription with your program and help with the sticking points, and come up with creative ideas on how things can be a little bit better and easier for you. All right, let's see. I see a question. Do you plan to use this tool in preclinical curriculum? You guys see that question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, so we typically are using it in our clinical curriculum. Any of the courses with cases, I have the Practice Smart questions. So while they may not have a Calibrate assessment to go with it, the students could use the Practice Smart to self-assess. Cindy, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think the questions are really geared a bit more towards the clinical end. The cases are for both preclinical and clinical year, but students your motivated preclinical student will do them anyway. I guess for me, those questions are just, that certainty rating just adds so much. Again, especially with the struggling learner. A student who does well, they calibrate themselves. They say, oh, I didn't know this piece, and they figure out how to do it. A struggling learner just, they don't know how to figure that out. So having that certainty rating to say, ooh, these are the items, and it just gives them a much more directed and focused approach than saying, I'm studying all of cardiology, which isn't going to happen. And then they get frustrated because they can't get through it all because they've overspent that time. So I think it really is nice. It's also a nice piece that you can use when you're meeting with students, especially struggling learners, or even in your regular meetings with students, to say, so show me your study plan, because now they really can have a directed study plan. Some of these study plans we see, right? I'm going to read all of my cardiology notes. I'm going to read all of my pediatrics notes. And I'm like, that's never going to happen. And I'm going to do 8,000 questions. Like, they have things that aren't realistic. And now these to-do lists allow them to get really specific. And I think it just gives them a lot of confidence boost when they realize, I did know something. I just didn't know this piece. And now I can go learn that. Mm-hmm. And having that case there, which gives them relevance versus a factoid in a test bank, I think is the big difference.
Absolutely.
We didn't have time to really dive into the individualized learning plan that really comes with Calibrate, but like Cindy said, that is a nice tool to help coach a student through kind of goal setting. And especially if they're thinking at like the macro level, they're halfway through the course and you're doing mid-rotation feedback. Use that tool even outside of Aquifer to say, like, what are your goals for learning? And it'll list any Aquifer cases that they have on their to-do list. So I think that's really helpful. I also think, you could try this with preclinical learners and see how it goes, but take the demo first.
Right.
The questions that I tend to get wrong. I'm an internist and pediatrician, and I'm many years out of training. And so I were like the pathology questions that I was like, okay, I haven't thought about that because it's not so directly relevant to my day-to-day patient care. So they might actually do quite well on them because they're much closer.
And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a faculty member, when we go into our aqueduct and look at our cases, like if I go in Open Family Med, to the right, it does say, it says questions. And if I click on that, it allows me to see those questions. So I get a sense of what they're going to be asked, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you want to go look at it, open up Family Medicine, look at a couple of cases and say, well, let me see what the questions look like. So you'll know that you can use them. I do think that, especially with struggling learners, when you meet with them, it's a lot of times hard to say, well, what have you done? And, again, when they start listing those scary resources and flashcards and the things that you're like, no, those aren't, they like them because they're easy and it gives them confidence because they're like, I love this tool. And I'm like, oh, not a great tool. I'm thinking that in my head. But I never want to say that. But, you're thinking it and you try to explain, well, that's because it's very superficial. So when they bring in an individualized plan and they'll feel better about, I looked at this, I did this case, I now understand X. I just feel that targeted, more specific, they feel better about themselves.
I think it's brought up one other point. There's times for when you only have a few minutes here and there or a flashcard, that shallow work can be, I guess, a good use of time. But I think what we need to probe students to do is do that deeper work that takes a little more focused efforts. And sometimes students will push back that the aquifer cases are long. One, they don't have to be all done in one sitting, but two, that deep work, that like long drawn out encounter is going to hit a number of different learning points, number one. And number two, like that's real life. And so, those are real patient encounters. Perhaps they're putting into one case, several follow-up visits, but that kind of deep work where they put away their phone and they focus for 30 to 35 minutes on a case actually can be that more sort of impactful learning that I think you lose when you're only doing flashcards. And I think we're really, as educators, trying to fight against because we have so many distractions.
Right. And I'll just never forget, the student said to me once, it's not like aquifer. I go and I do I take a shelf exam and I'm like, oh, that question came out of aquifer. But they told me, I think better because I did these cases. I was able to do well on my shelf exam, my end of rotation exam, because I did the cases. My thought process was better. And I'm like, oh, eureka, there it is, the aha moment that you wait for.
That's awesome. Do we have any other questions?
Cindy, Joe, Mimi, and I are always happy to meet with you one-on-one or small group with you and educators at your institution if there's specific things that you need to know related to Practice Smart, Calibrate, or just integrating aquifer. So please use us. We love hearing from you and kind of walking through what you're going through and how we can help.
Absolutely. And I think that might be the perfect way to conclude this webinar today. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our presenters, Kim and Cindy. We hope you will join us again for future webinars, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Have a great day.
Have a good one.